Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest returning for a solo episode for the first time. And I just looked actually right before we hopped on episode 176. So we're in like the 350s now. I increased the
Wow.
frequency of when I release episodes. So that obviously bumped that number up a little bit. But 176, it was mini cuts. Obviously, you've been on plenty of times since then, but just we've had Jeremiah as well too. But we decided, hey, let's have you hop on here for a solo episode. So Brandon, appreciate you taking time out of your day, man. And hopping back on here and coming back on the podcast.
Absolutely, my man. I'm happy to be here, and I'm surprised. I didn't realize time goes by so quickly. I believe we recorded that because you've been banking. I know you're incredibly busy with podcast recordings and stuff. So oftentimes we'll record something and it won't get released for 4 or 6 weeks. So I think we recorded that in around June of 2022. So it has been close to a year and a half, and it's crazy to see the growth that you've had with the podcast. So kudos and congrats to you. And I'm glad to be on. I love our coaches roundtable. We always get a lot of great feedback on that, and that's like the bros chatting essentially. Like we go over our lifestyle and different things, but then we'll touch on our opinions on hot topics within the industry. But we've had, if we look back, probably 24 like deep dives that we've done over the years, and we've had a lot of great feedback on that. So I'm looking forward to this one and just being able to give an update, maybe to with today's topic in terms of updated thoughts on research, as well as how to essentially my whole goal is always to bridge the gap between research and information and practical application. So I hope to be able to do that on today's podcast.
Yep. No, man, you always do a great job of that. And you mentioned the growth of the podcast, and it's obviously been helpful with guys like you coming on here and helping spread the word of the podcast too. That's obviously been super helpful. But yeah, looking forward to chatting with you today. And I'm shocked at how you remembered the date of that, because it was August 2022. And like you said, it was probably June or July. So I'm impressed that you remember that.
That's my man.
I was going to say that just goes to show how much information you can retain in that brain. Cool, man. Why don't you give just a little bit update on you in terms of where you're at from like a training perspective, or anything just in life too?
Yeah, absolutely. Life and business as a whole has been really busy, at least the last few months, as well as the last year in general, to be honest with you. But being busy is a blessing. So it's always something that I'm extremely fortunate for and very grateful that I'm in the position that I'm in. But in terms of like training, nutrition, those type of updates, this week I'm actually wrapping up a building phase that I've been in for about 5 months at this point. During this time, I've been running a delt specialization cycle where I've been allocating a higher percentage or essentially a higher portion of my volume budget to my side delts. This past week, I'm going to be wrapping up the third mesocycle of that specialization cycle. And then my plan is for next week, I will be transitioning into a mini cut, which is ironic because that was the last topic that we really covered in depth. But yeah, I'll be utilizing a mini cut, which I'm projected probably to take around 4 to 5 weeks. And really the goal is I want to clean up my body composition first and foremost, but really like another ulterior motive, I guess you could say, is I really need to restore my appetite and improve my digestion. And in addition to that, I'm trying to give both my body and mind a break from pushing higher volumes over the last 4 to 5 months. And then also, I'm at the point where I'm pushing 4,000 plus calories a day. Really, at this point, I'm tapped out in terms of appetite as well as a desire to eat. And really, when it comes down to it, like the last few years, I've been a big advocate. And I think this is something we did a lean building podcast or maybe a P ratio podcast years ago. And I've been an advocate the last few years of utilizing a 4-to-1 ratio of building to cutting with both myself and then my clients. And when I was competing, it used to look a little bit differently. So it was the same type of ratio, but I used to go like 8 to 12 months of building and being in a surplus. And then I'd go to 2 to 3 months of going into a fat loss phase. But in the last year, I've honestly found that once I get beyond like the 6-month point of pushing food and being in a building phase and really pushing my training to elicit hypertrophy adaptations, I hit this bottleneck where my appetite essentially plummets, my digestion starts to become impaired, and continuing the building phase is no longer conducive to from both like a body composition perspective and then also productivity perspective. And I think this is something like very few people in our industry talk about, as if you really think about it, like many of the fitness professionals in our field who put out information or put out content, especially in the realm of optimizing muscle growth, they're either like competitors, they're either influencers, or they're mainly content creators. So they don't work with a lot of clients one-on-one. So they have a lot more time, energy, and effort to put forth and to focus on their own physique development. But honestly, like I'm at the point in my career where I'm working with a lot of clients closely one-on-one, and I'm also privately mentoring a group of other, coaches and fitness professionals. So I'm just in the state of mind or in the state of life, a position in life where I can't afford to like keep pushing a building phase if it's impairing my cognition, my thinking skills, or my ability to show up and be there for my clients, which is where I've actually found a benefit to taking an even more phasic approach to building and cutting cycles, where the past year I haven't really pushed my building phases as long, but I've also not done the long like diets down to essential body fat that I've done in the past. At both ends of the building and the cutting extremes, we have to realize there are inherent drawbacks. And we've done podcasts on metabolic adaptation. We've done podcasts on building phase mistakes actually that we did. And some of these will tie into there. There's drawbacks to both of those. And yes, there's physiological drawbacks, there's psychological drawbacks, but even from a business owner perspective, being an influence in this industry in terms of being a coach and being a leader, I find personally that when I push a phase a little bit too long, so a building phase past 6 months or a fat loss phase past 2 to 3 months, it starts impairing my ability to be productive and keep driving my coaching services forward. Safe to say, essentially, that I'm looking forward to the next month where I'm going to be pulling back on food, pull back on training a little bit over the next month, and then be able to essentially reset things physically and mentally before I go back into a lean building phase, because that is the reason why I'm doing a mini cut, because I am looking to potentiate future progress, give myself a little bit more runway. It's not only from a muscle growth perspective, but also really from an appetite and digestive perspective that this mini cut is really being targeted towards.
Yeah. So for you, your building phases, I got a couple questions on this. For your building phases now at this point, is it still, hey, I'm still trying to elicit hypertrophy? Is that still your main goal of them? And you're still trying to maximize that? Or what does that kind of look like there for you?
No, absolutely. So I'm at the point where I'm about to be 18 years into training. So muscle growth is a slow and steady process, to say the least. And so really how I align all of my building phases, I'll usually pick 1 to 2 muscle groups to specialize on. And so this past building phase, the entire emphasis was on really, it was deltoid development, but also it was specifically on my side delts. And so I actually titrated up my volume, and I didn't use like a volume ramping progression, but I essentially, over the course of the first to second to third mesocycle, I averaged anywhere between 14 to 20 sets per week just on my side delts. I used a lot of lengthened movements, essentially utilizing a lot of cable variations, things of that sort, did lengthened partials, more intensity techniques within my side delts. And I allocated more of my training budget towards that because it's training this last mesocycle. I was at 20 sets per week. I can't do that on all my body parts. I wouldn't A, have the time, B, I don't have the recovery capacity to do that. And so really I take a phasic approach with each phase where I'll really focus on one body part, and I generally will determine that after I diet down. So for instance, after the end of my last mini cut, which I did a brief like 4 to 5 week mini cut, I would assume about 6 months ago at this point. And we had done a podcast, actually, it was a coaching roundtable where I had wrapped it up. Jeremiah had just done one as well. And at the end of that one, I had seen that when I dieted down, because really at this point we're not seeing muscle growth day to day, week to week, month to month. Like it really comes down to when we diet down, we get a little bit leaner. We're able to see the areas within our physique that are needing improvement. And my delts were something that was a strong point when I was competing. I was utilizing a much higher volume. I had less stress in my life, less responsibilities, more time to sleep. There was many different factors and variables. I was younger. There were many things in my lifestyle as well as my programming that were different. And my delts were a pretty good body part. But then I had a car accident. There was many things that came into the fray the last 3 or 4 years, which have slowed down my rate of progression on certain things. I was dealing with a shoulder injury as well. So this year I was in a position where when I got done with the mini cut in the middle of the year, or in the spring, essentially, I saw that was an area I want to bring up. So I really just put my blinders on and my goggles on, essentially, and just really focused on that for this mesocycle. So I'll do that same type of program or that same type of approach where I'll essentially do what I do with clients. I'll do a needs analysis. Really how my process goes for myself, to be honest with you, is I cut off my head and I send myself check-in pictures every week. So I treat myself just like a client, but I also have a network of mentors, of other coaches that I trust first and foremost. I have an immense amount of respect for. So I often will keep them on retainer. So sometimes I pay them and I don't even check in with them, to be honest with you. It isn't like an ongoing thing, but it is something that, every say 2 to 4 weeks, I'll check in with them and just say, hey, listen, this is what I'm thinking. Let's bounce some ideas off of each other. I want your objective feedback, because coaches need coaches. So just because I've been coaching 11 years at this point, going on 11 years at this point, I still need some objectivity, because we can always get in our own heads. And I really think that sometimes I need to divorce myself from the process. So at the end of this next mini cut, I will contact a few mentors that I have. I will send them pictures at the end of what I'm looking like from a mini cut position, like where I get to leanness wise, but also physique shots, both relaxed as well as in the men's physique poses that I used to hit when I was competing. And then we'll go from there. I'll get their feedback on what muscle groups they think I should work on. And there's often times where sometimes I'll just hand my programming, whether it be training or generally nutrition. I do most of myself, but I'll give him a shout out. One of my closest mentors, his name's Joe Jeffrey. He's a immensely successful coach in the UK, and really reconnected probably about 5 years ago when I was still competing. And he's very successful on the IFBB, especially in Europe. So he coaches, at this point, he doesn't even take on clients, but his whole roster is essentially IFBB pros. I'm probably the only person that has continually been on his roster in terms of going back and forth with him that essentially at this point I'm like fitness professional / like hobby builder, rather than I'm not a lifestyle client, but I'm also not a competitor. So almost every single person he works with are IFBB pros. So for instance, one of his clients is Jared Feather from RP Strength. So he's got really good roster of individuals that are both evidence-based as well as they're just very advanced. So he is someone that I often go to for advice, for feedback. A lot of times I'll have him do my training programming just because all day, and I'm sure, Jeff, you can relate to this, like we're coaches and yes, we could program for ourselves, but oftentimes we're sick of programming by the time we get done with our clients. B, it's less exciting. And there's some motivational drive that comes from getting a program from someone else, trying something new. And then also it can often, we can fall into our own bad habits, for instance. So there might be certain movements that we're more comfortable doing, and we may not push ourselves out of our comfort zone, or it could even be like repetition ranges that we're not going into. Or for instance, I've been doing a mentorship this past year with Chris Beardsley. And one thing he's really, I guess, influenced or he has pushed me to do is try lower rep ranges. I was at a point where I probably didn't take for a few years a set of any set on any exercise below 8 reps. But within the last 4 to 5 months that I've been mentoring with him, I went down to the 5 to 7 range on certain movements, especially like compound movements. I'm really trying to drive progressive overload, see strength increases on those movements outside of that or below that 8 repetition range. And so these are just different things that sometimes someone can open your mind to something that can work. So for instance, we know from the rep range continuum that we can grow anywhere from 5 to 6 reps on the lower end to up to 30 to 35 reps on the higher end. And this is actually something we're going to get into in terms of individual responses to rep ranges and loading zones in particular. But sometimes because we have a preference towards a certain rep range. So I'll tell you personally, I have a preference towards the 8 to 10 rep range. I wasn't for years. I just wasn't taking myself down to those 5 to 7 reps. So I wasn't seeing the load increases that I could if I had just utilized a lower rep range. So these are just things that when you have people that you trust their information, you trust their credibility, but also you respect them, they're able to open up your mind to different, philosophies as well as different approaches.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. I agree 100% on that. Like you said, and like you said, opening your eyes to that and then being able to apply that to your clients, because we can maybe get into our own head with all that if we don't have somebody programming for us or telling us what to do there with that. So you can get your own head, and it's nice to have that extra set of eyes and have somebody else program for you. And like you said, get outside of your comfort zone there on that. Yeah, I'm looking forward to diving into the individual responses of training. I think that'll be super cool. I have 2 questions to go off of your building phase, because you mentioned that you're now in the kind of thought process of, hey, maybe I dial back the length at how long I'm going to be building for, and then run a mini cut. It sounds like maybe it's a little bit shorter than what you potentially have done in the past. Is that something that you would maybe recommend for Gen Pop clients, maybe somebody that's not as advanced as you are? Do you think there's something to going a little bit shorter, or do you think you're just there because you've been doing it for so long and it's like the amount that you need to do to gain is going to be different than somebody else?
Yeah, I think it's really individual. I think obviously it depends, but I think the reason that I've gotten to this phase or this stage in my training career, as well as just in my lifestyle, is because I have steadily increased my business. Just last year, I still had a corporate job and I was running a successful coaching business. And at this point, I've left the corporate world, and really my main emphasis and my main focus is on my clients, and it isn't on my physique progression. So I'd be lying if I told you that was my number one priority. It isn't. I'm in a different stage of my life, in my career, in all aspects. And I always had this 2 out of 3 rule. So if you think about I know you're familiar with sports, like batting average. If you get 2 out of 3, man, you are a Hall of Famer. And so I always had this mentality. I used to call it the 3 Fs. And essentially it was my different priorities in life. So we have fitness, and then we have family and faith. So one aspect is fitness, one is family and faith, and one is finances, which essentially encompasses business. It encompasses your career progression. And I always used to prioritize 2 out of 3. And oftentimes, I'll be completely frank with you, throughout all my 20s and my early 30s, it was always fitness number 1, and it was finances number 2. So I was looking at essentially getting physique progression, but also doing really well in the corporate field that I had, or that I was in. I worked in the sports nutrition industry for 14 years, and then also with building my coaching business. And at this point in my life, my emphasis or my priorities, those 2 out of 3 rule, is really on family as well as it is on finances and building my business. And it's not that fitness isn't a priority to me. I still train at least 5 times a week, sometimes 6. I still do daily steps. I still do cardio. I still go through, I'm still living the lifestyle that I used to previously, just not to the extent that I did. So the tight regulation on every single thing, the supplementation, all these little nuanced variables, I don't always do it. And it's not that, how do I put this? Essentially, it's very time consuming, and I had to prioritize one thing or the other. And I got into a point a couple years ago where I had individuals that I was working with that were much more successful at physique sport than I was. They were better competitors. I had guys that were getting to the Olympia level. They were winning pro shows or placing at pro shows. And it got to the point where I really had to sit myself down. And this is something that I think a lot of people fear when they come from an athlete background, whether it be college sports or it be they were a physique competitor themselves, and they have goals or dreams of turning pro or really chasing this to the nth degree. And I really do believe that we all should push ourselves to our maximum potential and try to see what that is and see where our ceiling is. But at that point in my life, bodybuilding was everything, competing was everything. And so I had a very strategic approach where I put myself into elongated phases where even towards the latter end of that 8 to 12 month building phase, I felt like shit. I was starting to get insulin resistance. I'm seeing fasted blood glucose go. My blood pressure is increasing, but there's a price to pay for everything that we do in life. And so at this phase of my life, like that isn't my concern. That isn't my priority. And it really is really helping my clients. And I get so much more fulfillment. Like I still coach a good amount of competitors, and I get so much more fulfillment out of seeing them succeed on stage than I ever did with myself. And that is something that it was really hard the first couple of years that I decided to step away from competing. Last time I competed was 2019. And I didn't even think that was my last year. I was on like the edge or on the borderline, but really what ended up happening was COVID. And then I realized like I had all these clients I was working with and I didn't have an opportunity to compete. The Northeast, we were shut down the longest. Actually, New Jersey was shut down the longest besides California. And it just took me out of a contest prep kind of type of scenario. Every single summer I competed, it was my routine. And that summer I didn't compete. And it really made me sit down and think to myself, like, what type of impact do I want to have? Is it going to be, am I going to go all in on coaching in terms of myself, because I did prep myself. So that was a huge responsibility and kind of weight on my back. And really looking back, I really should have entrusted into a coach at that point. I had some coaches previously. It just, I guess I wasn't really satisfied with the level of communication as well as the attention to detail that I got at that point. And so I really had to sit myself down and say, am I going to go in the direction of competing, or am I really going to invest myself into the individuals that have much more potential than I do? And then also, I really love doing this. I want to do this as a long-term career. Like I never saw myself in the sports nutrition industry long-term. I always saw myself going into coaching. I just held on a lot longer than most people because I needed to make sure I have some family issues. I had lost my father right before COVID, and then I take care of my mother who has not been in a good state physically the last few years. And so I need to make sure it wasn't just about me. So it wasn't like I could leave and go all in on my coaching unless I was financially secure. And I was at a point last year where I could do so, and very fortunate and grateful to be able to do that. And so now it's been all in. I've been laser light focused on building this business and really just helping as many people as possible. And sometimes I'll prioritize getting on a podcast with you instead of eating a meal. And that was never like, Jeff, if you knew me 5-6 years ago, that would have never happened. I would be eating while we're talking. It was me first. And it isn't that way anymore. And I think that we all need to go through those phases of our life. I went all in on myself and I went all in on this goal. And there may be a point in my life 5-10 years down the road where I'm in a position where I can ease back off business and I can go all in on physique competition. But really, there's very few people that are successful, immensely successful in both. And my real priority is being a coach and an educator. So that's really where my focus lies. And that's why I found an advantage to utilizing shorter building phases, to loop it back around to your question, because I just see that mentally, cognitively, even my ability to dictate, like to be able to communicate information, to remember. I have a pretty good memory when it comes to research or even comes to dates. So you know that I'm spot on. But when I get to the end of a building phase, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, when I get really lean, I've been dexed at 4.7% body fat. I'm not a functioning human being at either end of that spectrum. And that's me being completely objective. And a lot of people that have never pushed themselves to that point will never understand what I'm saying. But there is a point where you hate food. You are sick of eating and you just feel like you have this postprandial somnolence, which is that sleepiness that you get after every single meal because it just feels like overbearing. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there's times like you're so lean and on such little calories that you cannot sleep. Like you're waking up at 2 to 3 a.m., which I already do now. But years ago, when I actually had a normal sleep pattern and didn't work with people around the world, like would wake up at 6 a.m. But there was many contest preps and many diets where I would be up every single morning at 2 to 3 a.m. because my cortisol was through the roof. I was getting an adrenaline response. Like my body was just trying to it's like that food seeking behavior. It's trying to push me out to the kitchen to get some food. But I knew that was not on plan. And there was, come hell or high water, I wasn't breaking the plan. And so I'm right now with where I'm at in life, where I'm at in business, and really what I want to put out into this industry, the way I want to move content delivery as well as information and education forward, that would not be conducive for myself nor the clients that I work with.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So it's individual. And basically your thought on that is once you push past that point, it's just that trade-off. It takes too much away from what your main goals are. And same thing with cutting, right? Like you said, when you get super lean, it's the same thing. So for you, you found that happy medium there of, hey, I'm still going to push it. I don't want to go past this point based on my goals. So yeah, no, I think that's awesome. And yeah, again, I think we all need to do that and figure out what that is in that period of time in our lives. Cool, man. Let's dive into the topics. I know we wanted to talk about your different views on training and programming related topics. I know you said you've gotten super interested in response heterogeneity. So basically the concept of like how different individuals respond to training, especially resistance training. I think this will be super cool to chat about because I think with this topic, everybody's what's the best frequency? What's the right amount? What's the best amount of volume? Should I progress volume? What's the best rep range? And it's like when it comes to hypertrophy, man, it is all over the place. And so I think this will be super
Absolutely.
cool to chat about. So I'll hand it over to you and we'll have you start off with it and we'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So you had brought up the topic to me essentially a few weeks or a few months ago, actually, that how had my views changed on different aspects of fitness, of nutrition, things you wanted to know about training, nutrition, and that's really what we're going to focus on today. But I had to really look back because initially we're going to do this podcast on some of the things that we've covered previously. A lot of the stuff that we covered, we've done insulin sensitivity, we've done building phase mistakes. These are a lot of things that a lot of people have covered, but also there are topics that haven't really evolved in the last year or so. And so even like mini cuts, it's not, yes, sir, my opinions have changed within the last year, but it hasn't been anything drastic to really give a lot of information about or even be able to open up someone's eyes. So I figured that we went back and forth and this would be a great topic because really when it comes down to it, how my views have changed on training in the last 2 to 3 years, it's really shifted as a result of getting really into literature on the topic that you just described, which is response heterogeneity, which essentially looks at how different individuals respond to the same training program and how vastly different those responses can essentially differ between individuals. So often when we speak about the research or the results and findings of a study, we talk about the group means as research reports averages. So we're talking about the average response to a specific training program or training variable, whether that be volume or frequency or loading zone or rep range. But just because the group on average responded to an intervention in a certain way doesn't mean that everyone will respond to that type of training approach or even just that singular variable in the same way as within every training study. We have outliers who either respond more favorably or those who respond less favorably. And a lot of times you'll hear sometimes category of things like non-responders in training studies, but we have to realize, and what's interesting about this is if you actually look in the literature on this, there's multiple reviews, meta-analyses, and studies that actually find that there aren't, when they do systematic reviews essentially, and they look at a large body of literature and multiple studies, there are no non-responders technically. There are non-responders to a certain intervention. So say we put a group of individuals on a training study and it is 10 sets per week. Let's just use like a hypothetical landmark. And so they're utilizing 10 sets per week on the quadriceps. There are individuals that will have a hyper response. So they'll be at the end, we'll look at like the scatter plot on the data point and they'll be all the way at the top of the distribution curve. And they will be the high responders. They would have gained 10% in their quad cross-sectional area. And then we'll have those that are on the low end. And we'll see most of it is going to scatter around the middle, which would be the average. So say 5% increase in cross-sectional area. But then we'll even see people that are below the 0% line, meaning they actually lost muscle in response to this training intervention. So a lot of people take that as certain individuals just they can't grow muscle, but that isn't really what the literature actually shows. It's more so that certain individuals for certain programming variables or types of programs, they are non-responders. However, if we were to shift the training paradigm, we were just shift the programming, and also keep in mind that research is generally not customized to the individual because we're trying to isolate variables. That's the scientific method. So we cannot, just because someone's not responding, say that it's too little volume or too much volume. We can't just change it just for that one single person that isn't responding. So really what we have to realize is that there are going to be outliers both on the low end and the high end. And the reason I got into this was seeing as my main focus when looking into literature is to evolve my coaching practices and the approaches that I take with individual clients. I found a benefit to looking into specific programming variables and then seeing how those variables, how essentially variable the response can be between individuals rather than just focusing on the group averages, which is what many focus on. So often when we talk about training studies, like we'll give generic information out. So we'll look at meta-analysis, we'll look at 1 to 4 sets provided 64% of the hypertrophy outcomes. Then 5 to 9 sets provided, I believe, 84% of hypertrophy outcomes. And then 10 plus sets per week provided 100% of hypertrophy outcomes. Remember, that's on the group average. However, there's people all over the map, essentially. And so really what I wanted to do was to look at, and what I really got interested in was I have such a wide variety of individuals that I work with that I can't just look at averages. I have to look at, are there people that are higher responders, lower responders, and then also what programming variables are causing that? So really within the last few years, there's been a few resistance training studies which have changed my views on various topics and have pushed me to try different approaches within my own programming and then also how I approach programming with my clients, especially because I work with such a wide variety of clients. So it's not like I have one specific niche or type of clients that I work with where I can utilize more I guess, broad-based or generic research, or just use a meta-analysis and be that as like the end-all be-all. I really need to take an individualized approach, both to myself, but then to each and every individual that I work with.
Yeah. So it's, again, I'd like to hit on this fact that it's, hey, these studies, they're taking the average of that. And it's like, you have people all over the place. And like you said, I don't think people really fully understand that's the case there with that. And so I think that's super important to let people know here with that. So cool. Yeah. Again, I think this will be a super cool topic. And again, maybe this will shed some light for people here to potentially try different things. And maybe you come away with this and you're just like, oh, no wonder that person thinks that way of training works. And maybe it doesn't work for that person. So cool. So let's start with individual responses to different training frequencies and volumes. I think this one will be super cool here.
100%. So the reason I guess the benefit of this study was, we're going to go over a study by Damas and colleagues. And this was really the first study that got me into the topic of response heterogeneity. And it was conducted in 2019. And essentially what they did was they looked at individual hypertrophy responses to both high and low training frequencies, and also different weekly training volumes. And what's cool about this study is they used a within subject design where each participant trained one of their quads 2 to 3 times per week. So that was their training frequency. And this was categorized as low training frequency. And then they trained their other quad with a 5 times per week for training frequency. So each participant was able to act as their own control, as each condition, their nutrition, their sleep, say like their stress, and all of their variables were essentially the same. So we're essentially comparing the response to these different training frequencies within subjects. So we have all the same variables within the training, and they're doing it at the same time. We're training one leg with one frequency and one leg with the other, but it's during the same time course of a study. And so everything else is equated, and we're just seeing the individual response to the differences in training frequency and training volume, because in each session, they train their quads with 3 sets per week. So basically, one quad was trained 2 to 3 times per week with 6 to 9 sets per week. And then the other quad was trained 5 times per week with 15 sets per week. So we're seeing differences in both frequency as well as total volume per week for the quadriceps. And what's interesting about this study is that they found that 1/3 of individuals grew more from the high frequency, high volume condition. 1/3 of individuals grew better from the lower frequency, lower volume condition, and 1/3 grew the same from each condition. So with both legs, it didn't matter if it was the higher frequency, higher volume condition, or it was the lower frequency, lower volume condition. They essentially responded the same. So this research shows us that we can see a massive variability in the dose response of volume as well as frequency. But really, when we think about frequency, it's just an ability to dose. It's a dose response lever to pull for volume. And we can see a massive variability between individuals, which I'll tell you, this is what I've seen in my own experience with clients. I've had clients who respond better to lower volume programs, and then I have others who responded better to higher volume programs. But I've also had clients and this is what's really important, because this was only done on the quadriceps, but really, with the research that I've done since then, and then also when I just think about this critically, I've even seen inter-individual responses within clients, within muscle groups, meaning that I have some clients whose body parts respond different to different training volumes. So some will have body parts that respond and grow from, say, 6 to 8 working sets per week, and it's a dominant muscle group for them. But then they have other muscle groups which are a lagging muscle group. So this is something we might utilize a specialization cycle with, and we might do some volume ramping for a short period of time with. And these are muscles that require, say, 20 plus sets per week just to see progress in. So there's this massive variance or variability even within subjects as well as between individuals. So we have to realize it's not only between individuals, but it's also within the same person. And I've also seen this personally with myself. And so really, when it comes down to it, I know that a lot of times when we speak about volume, and if someone gives us just a general question, so you, I, and Jeremiah are on a coaching Q&A, and we're on a roundtable, and someone asks us, what is the best, would you advise for training volume? I'm an experienced training. Most of us will probably say 10 plus sets per week, because that is where the meta-analytic literature shows. But really, this type of research that looks more on the individual responses to training variables such as volume has shifted my philosophy on volume at this point, where it should be more individualized to the person and the muscle group. And how I do it within my own programming, and I even hit on this with the DELT specialization cycle, I will allocate more volume towards body parts that need more work. Whereas if others are high responders in certain muscle groups, then I'll use less total volume in those muscle groups so that I can bias more of their weekly training volume budget to the body parts that need to come up more. So it's really like we're trying to look at things as like expense accounts, and I'm trying to look at my different, volume, I guess, measurements or volume doses as investments. So say, for instance, this last mesocycle, I need to invest more of my volume budget into my deltoids. So that's what I did. But I pulled back on other muscle groups. So my hamstrings were trained at 8 sets per week. My chest was trained at 12 sets per week. There was other body parts that I took down. My back was trained at 10 sets per week. And that's a muscle group that I generally have responded pretty well with. But I ran that 20 sets plus sets per week, but I just didn't need it at this past mesocycle or this past macrocycle construction. And so it really is about allocating things in a way that it's more individualized to the person, and then as well as how they respond. So that's where we can utilize, like I've done a lot of specialization cycles with clients, and we'll try to bring up a certain muscle group and I'll see how they respond to different increases or different, I'll test their response to a baseline volume and then increases in volume. But sometimes someone is very responsive to volume increases or set additions. And then sometimes someone is very responsive to static volume. And all we're doing is modulating relative intensity via IR progressions. And that's how they're making their best gains and their best strength progression. So there's basically, when we really look into this literature, it's cliche to say, but there's multiple roads to Rome, or essentially to gains.
With that, you mentioned not only is there going to be a difference from person to person, but even within each muscle group potentially as well too, you're going to notice this difference as well too. And I can say the same thing with myself as well too. For example, I wouldn't be able to hit my quads 3 times a week, where I could probably hit my delts or something like that 3 times a week there with that. And shoot, even I could probably get away with 1 day per week of quad training, where some
Absolutely.
people need 2-3 days a week. So there's that too. And I think that's super important there on it. And I also like too that you hit on the fact that within these studies too, they did both legs, which can be super helpful because, like you said, you're not getting things like sleep or life stress or whatnot between people there with that. It's all set. So then you can take that information. I was curious too, and I'm sure you're familiar with this study, but I don't know who it's by, but I'm sure once I bring it up, you'll know who. And I think this could also go to the importance of volume dosing for the person. I think they did the one study where they like gave people like the set amount of sets. It was like 22 sets or something like that. And then they added 20 sets to what they initially, or 20%, they increased their volume by 20% of what they were doing. And that tended to be a little bit better than giving them like an exact dosage amount. And I think that's probably another study there that would lends towards that individualization of volume and things like that.
Absolutely. So you're referring to Scarpelli and colleagues, and this is actually, we'll discuss this a little bit later, but this is a study that actually shifted my thoughts and my approach to volume adjustments throughout the course of a mesocycle, as well as individualizing training volume. So just like you alluded to, essentially it was within subject design, and they looked at utilizing in one condition on one limb, they utilize a 20% increase in the person's baseline training volume. So where were you averaging in your quadriceps for the months prior to getting into the study? And then it was just a 20% increase. So for instance, Jeff, if you were training your quads with 10 sets per week, we would increase that to 12 sets per week for the remaining time period. In the other hand, they utilized 22 sets per week, which was like a set static amount of volume in the other leg. And so they compared the averages, or they compared the responses to both, and they found that it was more advantageous to utilize an individualized approach to volume. And I think that we could, I don't want to extrapolate too much, but I could say that if someone comes to me and they're training really high volume on a certain muscle group because it's a lagging body part and they're not seeing a response, and there's someone that just in their previous history, like I work with a lot of advanced clients and people that have a lot of knowledge on nutrition. I work with a large percentage of fitness coaches, fellow nutrition coaches, fitness professionals, gym owners, things of that sort. A lot of them are experienced trainees. Sometimes they need more volume, sometimes they need less, but I always make it the adjustments that I make based off their baseline volume. So it's never, I may have someone come to me that's a HIIT proponent and they're training everything 4 to 5 sets per week, and that's it. It's not like I'm looking at Schoenfeld 2017 and saying, well, it's suboptimal that you're actually at the bottom end. You're only getting 64% of the gains that we see on the average level. And I'm going to increase this to at least a minimum of 10 sets per week because now I've just doubled their training volume. So that's 100% increase in what they were doing. That is not an approach that I think is evidence-based, nor is it something that would be individualized or catered to the person. And that's really where looking at some of this more nuanced literature on individual responses, on individualized training adjustments is really beneficial, especially from a coaching perspective, because if you're working with individuals or working with clients one-on-one, you can't just look, or you shouldn't just look at just the average responses to things. If you're working you're a coach that does group coaching, you're going to have to utilize a lot of the generic or the average responses to things, because you're not going to be able to individualize things one-on-one to every single person in your group. If you have hundreds of individuals in your training group, you're going to have to go like the moderate approach that fits the most amount of people. You're trying to hit the majority of people, which is what research does for us. It points us in their direction, but it's never going to tell us how to train on any single day or how to train an individualized client. And that's where I found an advantage or a benefit to looking more into this area of the literature that I think a lot of people have overlooked, because this isn't a topic that I hear a lot of people hit on. And there's a lot of sexy topics within our industry: stretch media hypertrophy, there's volume dosing, things of that sort that are very hot right now. But and these often come from researchers and content creators. And a lot of times I think sometimes coaches will look to those individuals, which I think in certain cases, some of these guys are so well educated, as well as they're so good with research, that it's great to get their interpretation of a study. But it doesn't mean that just because a recent study, I saw I guess a hot take on a recent study that came out by Inez et al. And I've yet to read the study, so I wouldn't be able to go into the in-depths about it. I just haven't had the time to do so. But I saw that with 52 sets per week, essentially that was what one of a very known evidence-based practitioner was advocating, essentially, that this showed an advantage. And it's, but have you worked with people in the real world? Yes, I understand that the study, it's great. If those were significant findings, which I'm not sure because I honestly didn't read the study, but are you going to ask your client, who is a mother of 3 children, has a job, has a career, has a family to provide for, as well as a husband to take care of, to do 52 sets per week for her legs? Because I wouldn't, honestly. And as a coach, I really think that we have to always take that into consideration. Everything has to be taken into context. It's not just about optimizing a program or giving someone the optimal program for hypertrophy. It's about blending the two between what's optimal for someone's, physique goals, as well as what's practical and realistic for their lifestyle, their stresses, their lifestyle constraints. This is what real world coaching is.
My kind of thoughts on it too is how can somebody get the most like productive volume possible? And that's, again, I think that's going to be different from person to person in terms of what they enjoy, all these things that we're talking about, what's going on in their life. But at the end of the day, I feel like that's finding out what that is. It's going to take some trial and error, and it's not just going to come from looking at some studies and being like, oh, this is the best
100%.
for that. But yeah, no, I think that's super interesting there on that. So is there anything else you want to say on the frequency and volume side of things?
No, I think that study was a really good example of something that we should keep in mind, because it shouldn't be a blanketed approach. It shouldn't be, I only train people with a bro split, or I only do full body 5 days per week. I will often utilize different frequencies per different muscle groups with clients. So if I utilize a specialization cycle with a client, so for instance, we can go back to our friend Jeremiah. I had him on a chest and bicep specialization cycle for about 6 months in his previous building phase. And that was something that I titrated up the frequency as well as the volume on those two focused muscle groups. So I utilize a 3 times per week frequency on his chest, but a 1 time per week frequency on his lower body during that mesocycle. And then this last mesocycle that we went through, or this last training block that we went to, he was training legs twice per week. He was training chest twice per week. We were modifying the training frequency, but also the volume that I utilize within those muscle groups. And so this is just a great example of not everyone's going to respond to the same training frequency nor the same training volume. So there is an experimentation aspect to this. Coaching, yes, we want to do things with an evidence base as well as with an educated perspective, but there's also putting time into the trenches. Like, I will tell you, some of the greatest lessons I've learned is from wrecking myself or trying all these different types of programs, John Meadows programs, Eugene Teal, like everyone you could think of, I've, hired for coaching, or I've run their programs, and I've really tested them on myself and then seen how I've responded. And then I take the Bruce Lee mentality on a lot of things, where I take what's useful and discard what's useless. And then I'll plug it into my own programming. I never utilize anyone's model in terms of programming, but I have a certain flair to the way that I program things. But I've also gotten things from others that have had immense success. So we can learn from everyone. We can learn from other practitioners, other coaches, but also from research. And this is where I really find this to be beneficial, because there's times where I find that someone isn't responsive to once or twice a week training. However, and it could be, it's both. We have to realize there's an interaction between training frequency, training volume, and training intensity. But there's times that someone needs more volume but can't recover within session. They can only recover, say, for 6 to 8 sets per week, but that person might need 20 plus sets per week for that particular muscle group. That's where increasing their training frequency and even potentially decreasing the amount of volume per session. So for instance, if I have someone that, say, they could only recover from 6 to 8 weeks per session, but initially I didn't know that. So we went 10 sets per week, or 10 sets per session, and we were doing 2 times per week. They hit 20 sets per week. However, they really needed, say, 24 sets per week. And if I just dialed that down to 6 sets 4 days per week, or 8 sets 3 days per week, they might get better outcomes. But if I was stuck into this programming mindset where I only have clients train body parts twice per week, I could miss out on all the gains that individual could have if I was just willing to open up my mind, take some of this literature, and really keep it in mind when I'm making programming adjustments, and never having, we've often spoken about this, you and I, Jeff, I don't believe in set and forget principles or set and forget protocols. I believe in principles, and principles can be modified. And the methods that we utilize those principles within, we could adjust and we can modify and change to be able to fit the person that we're working with.
Absolutely. And I'm sure too, once you find something that works for somebody for a little bit, it might have to change that up a little bit as well too, depending on their circumstances that are going on too. So it's always changing there as well too. Cool. So let's dive into the individual responses to different loading zones and rep ranges.
Yeah. So honestly, this has been probably one of the biggest things that I've shifted my mindset on and changed my views on within the last year. And it's really the efficacy of loading zones and rep ranges. So in much of the literature that we have, we see that we can get, or we can essentially achieve, similar muscle growth from a wide range of loading zones and rep ranges. So training anywhere between 30 to 85% of our 1 rep max, and in rep ranges between, say, like 5 to 6 on the lower end, and then 30 to 35 reps on the higher end, will usually lead to similar hypertrophy outcomes, as long as we equate the number of sets being used and all sets are taken close to failure. But this is what the research on this topic finds on average. So just because most participants in a research study can gain similar amounts of muscle from both low rep and high rep sets doesn't mean that everyone will respond in that manner. So there was just a study that was released this past year by Carnero, which is a great example of how, although on average, trainees will respond similarly to moderate rep and high rep training, there are always individuals who respond better to one approach over the other. So in this study, what they did was they put women into a lower body resistance training program where they trained legs 3 times per week and divided them into 2 groups, which utilize a crossover design. So when we look at one group, the first group would go 12 weeks and they were training in the 8 to 12 rep range. And then they followed that up by training for 12 weeks or another 12 weeks in the 27 to 31 rep range. So this was a long study. This is a 6-month long study. So this is really good data to be able to look at because many of the training studies that we have are 6 to 8 weeks long, whereas this is 24 weeks long. And then, so that was what one group did. And the other group just did the exact opposite. So they did the same type of training, but in the opposite order. So they went 27 to 31 reps first, then followed by a training block of 8 to 12 reps. And the results found that gains in thigh mass were almost identical between the high load and the low load conditions for both groups on average. So on average, they responded favorably to both conditions. But if you actually look at the individual data points, it tells a completely different story, as some individuals responded better to low loads and worse when switched to high loads and vice versa. And another thing that they found, which was super interesting, was how, so when we talk about responders and non-responders, a lot of people think that's like a blanketed term. And so if someone's a responder, they're a responder to everything. Or if someone's a non-responder, they're a non-responder to every training intervention. But just like I alluded to earlier, that's not what we see. It's about they're a responder or a high responder to a certain type of training or to a certain approach to training, or they're a non-responder to this certain volume, intensity, all these programming variables. And so what they found was how well someone did with high load training didn't predict how well they responded to low load training and vice versa, which shows that some individuals will respond more favorably to high load, lower rep training, and others will respond better or more favorably to low rep or low load, higher rep training. Now, this is something I've seen in practice with many of my own clients, as I have some clients who respond better to high load training in more moderate rep ranges, and then I have others who respond better or essentially respond in the opposite manner. So they're going to respond better to lower loads and to higher rep training. But if I was to strictly follow what the body of literature said prior to the study being released this year, I could easily be under the impression that it really doesn't matter what rep range my clients train in. And as a coach, I think it's really important to consider the fact that there are individual responses to all these variables, but also there are other things that go way beyond the physiological, side of training that we have to consider. So another thing that I'm very big into considering is a client's personal preference as well as their training history. And I keep that in mind when designing a training program. So from a personal, preference perspective, I like to try to create a program that aligns with what a client will enjoy, as that is what will keep them motivated to train and will increase the likelihood that they are consistent with it and push themselves during their training sessions. But at the same time, if I have a client who comes to me and they're new and we have yet to work together, but they tell me that they've been stalled out for quite some time, which is often the case for many of the intermediate and advanced trainees who come to me, I like to look over their previous approach and their previous training history and say they've been doing the majority of their working sets in the 20 rep range per se. I may shift that down to the 6 to 12 rep range to see if we can utilize a different rep range and loading zone as a plateau buster. And then I also find that biasing more moderate rep ranges helps improve my client's ability to gauge their proximity to failure. As oftentimes when someone is training almost exclusively with higher rep ranges, and I see this with females so commonly, so it's not to call them out, this is not a sexist type of comment, but it's just something that I've seen so many times with the women that I work with, that they kind of bias, they're scared to train heavy, or they think that it's going to bulk them up, or there's a lot of myths around, especially female training and their response to resistance training. And a lot of times they're training almost exclusively at higher rep ranges and they're not getting as close to failure as they think. And often with higher rep training, there's so much like discomfort from the metabolite accumulation. And we've all been there. Like you do a high rep set of squats or you do any type of high rep, especially compound movement, you're going to get that gnarly burn in the muscle. And a lot of times this causes us to think that we're closer to failure than we actually are. And in reality, we would actually have a few reps left in the tank. So what I like to tell my clients is that in terms of looking at what are signs that they're getting close to failure, I always tell them if we're doing a higher rep set and you're experiencing discomfort, try to disregard that burn as a sign of getting close to failure. And really what I want them to focus on is seeing their movement velocity slow, because we know that when rep speed slows, it's a better indication that we're getting closer to failure and we're starting to get full motor unit recruitment. So I want them to look past the burn or the stopping point that they've had previously, because a lot of times people will say, I don't really respond well I recently had a client that just came to me, a female, she's She's a nutrition and fitness or a trainer as well. And she was doing really high rep work. And she told me that she felt she was non-responsive to resistance training. She just felt that she didn't respond like her other friends in the gym. And it really was not that she wasn't a responder. It was that she was way off from getting close to failure. And when I just shifted down her rep ranges, she was able, first of all, she's gotten immensely stronger over the last, it's been about 10 weeks that we've been working together so far. She's gotten like incredibly stronger, and she's really been able to elicit progressive overload, but also she's getting closer to failure. She's really seeing that point at which she is truly have maxed out her ability to continue pushing. But that was something she was limited on when she was training. Literally, most of her training was 20 to 25 reps. She was never getting to that point where she was actually really hitting true volitional failure.
Yeah. When I think this lines up with kind of what the research says on RAR too, right? Where it's like the higher the reps are, the more inaccurate it can be, the further away people are from failure there on that. And then even like lower body as well too, right? I think from my understanding, lower body, you combine that with higher reps and lower body, and now you're probably a little bit further away from failure than you think you are there. So that definitely lines up with that. And then, yeah, so I think that's super interesting, and probably, like you said, why a lot of people potentially, like females in particular, are the ones that they want to, maybe they're not happy with their leg training. And that's, I think, a big reason why they're with that. And I was going to ask you if previous training would affect that as well too. And you did mention that, hey, if somebody's been training in a certain rep range, they're not seeing results, maybe altering that up a little bit could be helpful there for them, because I'm assuming if somebody's been doing it one way for a while, maybe it's just, there's something to potentially just changing that up a little bit up there for a period of time. And I know you said you also did that yourself too now. Absolutely. Where you're training a little bit more in that like 5 to 8 rep range from time to time.
Yeah, not only is that going to expose us to a novel stimulus, and also I think there's some motivational aspects. So for instance, with this specific client that I'm referring to, she was doing 20 to 25 reps and she was like feeling sick after most of her sets. So she was pushing herself. I don't want to say that she was sandbagging it or purposely stopping her sets short of failure. She just didn't realize that she wasn't reaching failure because she was confusing and conflating metabolic accumulation and metabolic fatigue and cardiovascular or cardiorespiratory fatigue with actually muscular, peripheral, local fatigue. And so it was really having to have a lot of conversations with her, getting on Zoom, having consultations, really explaining things to her, and then going over videos of her training and really seeing that in her higher rep sets. So I kept some of the high rep sets initially because I wanted to see what her training approach was like. And all I did was I changed the exercise selection and things of that sort. But I wanted to see like exactly what her training was like when she was initially giving me feedback that she just felt like she was a non-responder. And we have to realize that not only is that a physiological thing, but also a psychological thing. So if someone thinks that they're not going to get a result, that's a nocebo effect. It's going to impair their ability to really push themselves, as well as it's going to cause greater frustration. So they might not have as much buy into the program. They might get a case of the efforts. There's going to be times where they just feel like they're not getting for all they're investing, they're not getting out the results that they desire or what they expect. And so that's really where we have to shift the paradigm, both from a mental perspective, but then also as a coach, we're looking at the physiological perspective. So now she's made incredible gains in the last 10 weeks. And I'm not saying it's only due to the novelty of stimulus. It's also multifactorial. We've changed her rep range. She's been able to get closer to failure. So now each set is more stimulative. And then also she's been able to gain strength and really see progressions in actually her load over time, where she was stuck in a lot of these same movements or at the same loads with the same movements in the same rep range because she had done it for so long. So we have to think about progressing the stimulus over time. As you get better, as you get stronger, as you get larger, you have to continue doing more. And it's not just more from volume perspective. It's more from putting in more intention into your training, better quality sets, but also progressing some type of that aspect of your training. So that could be load progressions, that could be rep progressions, but we have to get somewhere where we're actually increasing the stimulus over time to keep pace with those adaptations. Because if not, you're not going to get those adaptations. You're essentially not progressive. You're not inducing progressive overload in any manner. If you just stay stuck doing the same program day in and day out, the body would have adapted to that, and there's no further need for an adaptation to get bigger or stronger as a result. And so this is something you really do have to take into context or into consideration a client's background. What have they done? What do they like? So there's certain individuals that hate high rep anything, any high rep training. So I might undulate their rep ranges. So I utilize a lot of undulating periodization. So I might sprinkle in a couple sets of 15 to 20 on, say, a leg extension, but that's after doing lower and more moderate rep work early in the session. And all I have to do is check off like 2 to 3 sets of 15 to 20 reps on leg extensions at the end of their workout, when it's essentially the last thing they have to do before they get out the door. And I'll utilize that during the first training phase that I have with someone. But if they hate that and it's going to decrease their motivational drive because they dread going to that last exercise of leg extensions, that's actually going to decrease motor unit recruitment. So actually, if you look in the literature, neural adaptations and things of that sort, but also like motivation, we see that when we're more motivated to do, whether it be an exercise, a rep range, or just your program in general, you're going to get higher levels of motor unit recruitment because you're going to put in higher levels of effort. So really, when it all comes down to it, we can term it relative intensity, we can term it relative effort. It doesn't matter what it is, but you need to be intentional in the effort that you put into your training. You need to get focused and really push yourself to your maximum capability to continue progressing over time. However, if you hate something, just like if you hate an exercise, or if you feel that you're not good at it, there's going to be some mental limiters, and it will induce central fatigue, and it will lower motor unit recruitment as well as so many other things. So if we lower motor unit recruitment, that means you're not reaching your highest threshold motor units. So you're not being able to hypertrophy. Maybe you're getting the slow twitch fibers, but you're not getting the fast twitch fibers, which have the most ability to, or the greatest growth potential essentially. But also you're not getting as much mechanical tension stimulus that you could on the fiber level because you don't have full motor unit recruitment. And so this is where we have to look at the physiology of things as well as the psychology of things and be able to blend both, because coaching isn't just about throwing at a program and saying, do this. It is about molding, modifying, and meeting clients where they're at.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And I'm glad you brought up the fact about the personal preference. Like you said, I think there doesn't need to be some sense of, hey, you're going to have to get a little uncomfortable here. But I also think that what that person likes is there's going to allow them to stay more consistent and really push that training. So figuring out what that is. And for myself personally, as I've learned a little bit more about rep ranges and stuff, for myself, I've definitely found that not a huge fan of those higher rep sets just for kind of the things that you talked about there. And then same thing with clients too, programming these higher rep sets for clients. It just ends up being like they like you said, they're like maybe cardiovascularly closer to failure, but from a muscular standpoint, they're a little bit further away. And just because that type of training is just hard, right? It sucks. And I've definitely shied away from those higher rep ranges. But like you said, maybe every once in a while you're doing it on certain exercises and stuff like that. If you don't have anything else to say about loading zones and rep ranges, let's dive into how you've changed your approach to progressing volume across a mesocycle.
Absolutely. So this is more, I'm going to say this is probably over the last 5 to 6 years. I've really evolved my thoughts on these. And in the last 3 years, it really has been very focused on how I progress volume across a mesocycle. But if we were to go back, say, to 2019 and prior, I was a much bigger advocate of proactive training adjustments rather than reactive training adjustments. And I definitely think that there's a place for both. But the adjustments I make now are much different than I did back then. And that's just come from working with hundreds of more clients. Like over the last 4 to 5 years, I've worked with so many more individuals, not only in terms of the number of clients that I've worked with, but also people from all different backgrounds, different goals, different histories, and then also with keeping up to date with the volume literature. So years ago, I used to use a lot of built-in set progressions with myself and clients, where we'd essentially accumulate volume across the course of a mesocycle, very similar to the RP model, which is something I'll give them all the credit in the world. I utilize their templates. For myself personally, I utilized some of their training programs going back as far as 2017 to 2019. I was very heavily entrenched into their information. And at that point, actually, Dr. Mike was living in Philly. So he lived just about an hour from me, from where I was located. And so a lot of the people in the bodybuilding gyms that I was going to, they were big into RP strength. They were big into Dr. Mike, and as was I. And I still am. I'm a huge fan of him. He's a great influence in this industry. But I really took on their model of just adding sets per week. Every single week, we're increasing sets. And I'm sure that many, Jeff, I'm sure you did it. I know so many coaches that have now evolved from that. But at that time, that's what was really big. And I actually went to their first ever training seminar, which I believe was in 2018. And that was around the time when volume was really being looked at as the key driver of hypertrophy. You would see it on podcasts, you would see it on posts. Volume is the king. And so at that time, everyone was looking at increasing sets as being the most effective way to drive muscle growth. So this is something I tried myself, and then I tried with my clients. And nowadays, in comparison, I like to use more of a combination of proactive and reactive approaches to training progression with both myself and my clients. So on the proactive side, I'll increase relative intensity by decreasing reps in reserve across a mesocycle. And I'll also have clients aim to either progress their reps per set or load used across the mesocycle. So with many clients, I'm going to be starting their mesocycles anywhere between 2 to 3 reps in reserve. If they're more advanced and we really need to increase the stimulus, it's going to be 2 reps in reserve starting. And sometimes I'll do an undulation of reps. So it might be a 2-1-0 across their sets. But generally, say I look at my general client, it's going to probably be around 2 to 3 reps in reserve at the start of a mesocycle. And then we'll eventually progress them down to the point where they're training at 0 IRR for a period of time, so that every single mesocycle, we have an opportunity for them to see where failure is. And then what I like to have that do, and every training cycle that I do, I have someone train to failure. And the reason I do that is because I want them to recalibrate their ability to more accurately gauge their reps in reserve targets for their next mesocycle. So I really think of this, it's almost like when we're in a fat loss phase and we utilize a diet break and we teach a client how to go back to maintenance and how to live. Essentially, this is what your lifestyle is going to be once we exit the back end of the fat loss phase. I like to do the same thing in terms of recalibration techniques with training, where we get to the edge and we see where it is so that we know the next time that we go back to the week one of that mesocycle, where we really should be. Was that 3 reps in reserve or 2 reps in reserve on week one of your last mesocycle really accurate, or were you sandbagging it? So I like to utilize this recalibration technique, and those are all the proactive adjustments that I'm going to make. But then when it comes to training adjustments and modifications like set additions, I like to do this in more of a reactive manner in terms of how a client responds to the first few weeks of a mesocycle and to the baseline volume that mesocycle was set at. So the longer and longer I coach, the more I realize that our job isn't to predict the future. So having a program that has a ton of proactive adjustments built into it, such as having automatic set additions each week, which is something that I did. Now, when I look back, and now obviously much more experience, much more education, I realize that just really isn't effective as none of us, regardless of how long you've been coaching, I don't care who says that they can, none of us, no matter our experience, our expertise, we can't look in the future and predict how any single client will be feeling and responding weeks and months into the future. So for me to say, and this is wrong on me, and many of us have utilized this where we would set up a training paradigm and it would be in a spreadsheet, or it would just say every week you're going to add a set to this exercise. And you can't predict how that person or how that client's going to be responding, if they're going to even be at a threshold where they even need that, or if they can even recover from that. And this was something that was so prominent in our industry to utilize that I think that because volume was seen as the driver, all of us thought that was the most optimal way to do things. But really, when I look at the literature now, or I even look to my coach, I guess my approach to coaching, my goal is not to constantly change things, but rather to build an effective training program and then to adjust as needed based on that individual client's response to the training parameters and their biofeedback. So in the beginning of a mesocycle, I like to keep many variables the same, besides having clients either use load or rep progressions to meet their RIR targets for the week. And this allows me to isolate the amount of sets they're using per week so that we can improve the signal to noise ratio and reduce the noise in the data so that I can see a client's response more clearly, as I want to see how this client responds to a specific training stimulus instead of doing what a lot of coaches do, and they just throw shit at the wall to see what sticks. They're like praying to see what sticks. And that's really what I think that a lot of people are doing when they're just changing things constantly and making changes to training programs just for the sake of keeping clients entertained. Because yes, there is a psychological aspect to us, a motivational aspect to us, but really we're here to help our clients get to their goal and make progress. And it's not just about entertainment, it's really about progression. And just changing things and utilizing a ton of variables and constantly switching things up for the sake of novelty, that isn't helping them make any gains or even make any improvements. When it comes to the volume progression, I want to see how their recovery, their feeling of disruption, their soreness, their pumps, and their training performance goes over the first few weeks, and also where they're at in life. As just because someone, like if I have a client who was in a position in the beginning of a cycle to handle more training volume, just because they were in that position at the start of a mesocycle doesn't mean that they'll be in that same place physically, mentally, and also from a stress management and lifestyle perspective in 4 weeks' time deeper into the mesocycle. We have to take things on a week-to-week basis and really look at where they're at this single point in time and in this training cycle and really make adjustments from there. So if I have a client who is recovering well, they're not experiencing like overlapping soreness or high levels of fatigue, yet their rate of progress has slowed down or stalled in either a particular muscle group or across the board, that's usually when I'll make a volume adjustment to that muscle group or a few muscle groups that need a greater training stimulus. So what I like to do is I first like to find a dose of volume that myself or a client can train at and recover from and make progress with. And then I'm going to run that essentially base volume until progress starts to stall. And then from there, I'll make a modest increase in volume, increase from their baseline volume to increase the stimulus and help them with starting making progression again. And I also use more conservative increases in baseline volume now than I did years ago. And that actually, you alluded to this. It's funny. The reason that I make more conservative increases to someone's baseline volume is based on the study that you brought up, which is Scarpelli and colleagues, which, like we discussed, they use that within subject design. And it was essentially, they had one leg training with standard volume that was 22 sets per week. And that, if we look into what a lot of people in evidence-based fitness will suggest, 10 to 20 sets per week. So that's in the optimal range. And then they took the other leg and they trained that with an individualized volume of a 20% increase over their baseline volume. And they found that their gains in quad growth favored the individualized condition. So this is where we really see some practicality and not just taking like a set standardized approach to training where we put out this arbitrary number of 10 to 20 sets per week and every single person has to train within there. That's a wide range. So it might be 10 sets per week for some people. It might be 20 sets per week for other people. It might be 15 sets for the average people, but I might have a client that it needs to be 13 sets, or it's essentially an adaptive range. But we can't be just like really, I don't think we should be as coaches very narrow-mindedly focused on just one single thing. It always has to be 0 reps in reserve, or it always has to be 20 sets per week, because Schoenfeld et al. 2017 showed this, or Robinson et al. 2023 showed this. We really have to be a little bit more nuanced and realize that there's many interactions between volume, intensity, frequency. There's all these training variables. And then also we have to consider all the outside context from just the training itself, the nutritional status of the client, their sleep, their stress management, their lifestyle, their responsibilities, all these other things. And that's where real true coaching, comes into play, where we're considering so many things that go on far outside of the gym.
So you mentioned like progress slowing down, because I understand, hey, if somebody's there, it's tougher for them to add weight, or it's just hard for them to recover. Obviously, they're probably doing too much volume. But what about on the other side of things? You mentioned, hey, if things are going well, they're seeing good results, there's really no need to make any changes. I guess you could theoretically add some volume to see if that might help increase maybe hypertrophy potentially for that particular person. But what would be some signs of, okay, you've got their volume set and things are slowing down? Is it like a biofeedback thing? Is it you checking in with them, or is it like specific like objective markers that you're looking at there with that?
Yeah, it could be both objective and subjective markers. So if someone's recovering especially well in terms of they're not seeing any overlapping soreness, they're not having crippling soreness by any means, but we're not seeing training progressions. So everything else is looking status quo. Everything else looks good. Their recovery seems, adequate. Their sleep is in check. And now we also have to consider all the other variables that interact with these things. So we have to check, is protein intake adequate? Is their calorie intake? Are they at maintenance? Are they in the deficit? Are they in a surplus? But if they're, say, hypothetically, we have all the hypertrophy levers pulled up for optimal hypertrophy. So we have 2.2 grams per kilogram of protein, say, or 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram. We have them in a slight surplus. So 200 to 300 calories over maintenance, just as a hypothetical. They are sleeping 7 to 8 hours a night. They have very minimal stress. They're recovering well from their training. They're not experiencing overlapping soreness, but their training progression isn't moving up over time. So we're not seeing increases in load progression, or we're not seeing increases in rep progression, or we're seeing that they're just not having visually over longer time scales. And this is something that does take multiple mesocycles, and we have to look at across over a macro cycle. But we have a body part that has just stalled out in terms of its actual response to training, both visually as well as from a training performance perspective. And it could be that they're not getting pumps in that muscle. There's other indicators. So this could be both objective and subjective. And that's where we can utilize, say, a volume increase to increase the stimulus on that body part, or we can utilize different things such as switching out exercise selection. So it may be that we've just run its course with that exercise. And this is a topic actually that Chris Beardsley covers in great detail. So I would definitely recommend to him, but he has theories on regional hypertrophy. We know that we can hypertrophy specific areas of a muscle based on many different biomechanical variables and things of that sort. But there's certain individuals with how their levers are set up, how their moment arms, all these different things within a movement selection, that they will tap out their muscle growth potential in that certain area based on how they do their exercise. So we know that, say, a squat pattern, some people are hip dominant, some people are quad dominant. It's really going to matter on essentially your biomechanics. It's going to depend on your anthropometrics, things of that sort. But say someone has really maxed out in terms of their motor unit recruitment. They are an advanced trainee. Now if we look at like the spectrum of advanced trainees, we look at the set principle and things of that sort, we'll see that they're at the point where they really need to hypertrophy. The only motor units that they have left, or the only muscle fibers they have left, are the high threshold motor units and those fast switch muscle fibers. And they're really close to the ceiling of their potential for growth. That may be where they have maxed out the recruitment in that area of a muscle group. So the quadriceps, for instance, and say they've never done leg extensions. So they've never done any, it's a biarticulate muscle. We want some type of leg extension to essentially maximally hypertrophy the rec fem. That's where utilizing that muscle, switching out that exercise and switching to a leg extension, or including leg extension into their training program, could be a method of plateau busting. Or in the same instance, we could utilize, so there's many variables that we can utilize, but really when it comes to volume progression, it is everything's going well from a recovery capacity, but they're not seeing greater pumps in the gym. They're not seeing better performance in the gym. And also a huge feedback that I'll get from clients that are at this level, or I can do more. Like I've done more in the past, and that's where we really have to take a client's subjective feedback in mind. If someone's telling me that they feel like they could do more, first and foremost, and they're an objective individual, they're not going past like that optimal threshold per session, which is anywhere between 6 to 10, sets per week, or sets per session. We may be able to titrate that up. And here's the thing. This is all about individualized programming. So if we lose nothing by taking and looking at their baseline volume over mesocycle 1, and then just slowly titrating that up over mesocycle 2. It's not, I really never do where I'm increasing sets per week every single week, but it may be every 2 weeks I increase it's 1 or 2 sets increase. And I may have increased by the end of the next mesocycle, or their second mesocycle, I may have increased volume by 20 to 40%, and just seeing their response. Are they getting better pumps in the gym? How do they feel? How is their recovery capacity? Has this hindered or helped them?
Gotcha. Yeah. Like you said, it could be something that might take a little bit longer longer of a time. But again, looking at those objective and subjective measures are going to be super helpful there. Man, a ton of great information here. I guess before we wrap all this up, is there any kind of practical takeaways here or anything you want to like sum up here before we end this conversation around this?
Absolutely, my man. I know we have another topic to get to, and we're not going to be able to today, but I would love to come back on and we could do a part two. We've done it many times. We'll do nutrition and dieting, things that I've trained my views on. Yep. So we'll definitely have to get that in the books. But overall, I would just really, this has benefited me from a coaching perspective, but also even from my own perspective. It's opened up my eyes to things that I could be utilizing or doing differently within my own programming. And I really think the best message you can get out of this, and it's a twofold message. A, don't be scared of trying something new. I'm in no way, shape, or form am I advocating to be a program hopper. If you work with a coach and they've put you on a program, try it out. Give them the benefit of the doubt. Don't switch things on your own, because then you have a bunch of noise in the signal. You never get to see, did I really get the response that I could have, or did I mess that program up essentially? And it's not this black and white thing, but a lot of times I think that people are hesitant to try something new. So a coach, they go to a new coach, and I've had this many of times, they're scared to step outside of their comfort zone. They're scared to try something new. They know that it's not their expertise, or even fitness professionals, because I work with many of them. They're holding on, like tightly clutching, like their programming. They don't want to let go. And a lot of times I tell them this statement, and I say, divorce yourself from this process. I want you to divorce yourself from the programming process. Let me take this over. Let me take this burden. First of all, it's going to de-stress you. And all you have to worry about is executing. You don't have to worry about writing your program. You don't have to worry about thinking over the nuances. Let me do that for you. But also be open-minded and give it a chance. Especially if you're in intermediate or advanced, you're not making gains overnight. So we have to give it time to see. But also another big thing, and another thing that I really want to get this message out there, because I think it will help a lot of individuals, is the beauty of this area of the literature is it shows us that on average, everything works in terms of rep ranges, loading zones, there's so many roads to Rome. And so on average, we see what the majority of people do. So if you are working with a broad group of people, you could say, I can utilize the research as a compass, as a direction to point me in the right direction of where to go to with this client. So 10 sets per week. But we have to keep in mind that some people will respond better to less, or some people will respond better to more. But also, I think there's also a lot of self-limiting belief where people have tried something that someone else has. So they've utilized a generic program, they went on bodybuilding.com, or you tried your favorite influencers, your favorite fitness coaches, downloadable ebook or whatever it may be, and you tried an approach 3-2-1 or 5-3-1. You've tried different popular training approaches. You've tried Arnold's high volume training routine, chest and back. Right now, really popular Mike Mentzer HIIT routines. You've tried all these things and it hasn't worked for you. So in your mind, you think everyone I see on the internet responds well to this. Such influencer, this bodybuilder. I tried Jay Cutler's routine, Ronnie Coleman's routine. Why doesn't any of this work for me? And it's because it isn't customized for you. And realize that there is going to be an approach. We see in all aspects of the literature, aerobic training. We see this in diet, in glycemic responses. There are amazing studies on people's variability to glycemic responses, where some people have a higher blood glucose elevation. So after consuming a banana, than they do white bread. But if we actually looked at the glycemic index of fructose versus pure glucose, or essentially white bread, we would predict, based off of the data that we have on glycemic index, that you would have a much higher response from that white bread. We are all individuals. I'm not trying to make it sound like everyone's a special snowflake, because if we actually look genetically, we're about 99.9% similar. However, there's a range of things that can work for you. So it's never this one set and forget principle. But also, if you are someone, and I've interacted with so many people like this, where they think that this isn't for them. And if this is something you're truly passionate about, you want to improve your body composition, whether it be from an aesthetic perspective or a health perspective, or you just want to improve your longevity, how you feel, how you function, there is going to be a plan that works for you, but you have to be patient in the process. You have to be patient enough to try something out for long enough, say 12 weeks, to be able to see if it is for you. But if it isn't, you can't hold on to that, because that's the other end of the spectrum, where a lot of people, they get so entrenched into an ideology, whether it be HIIT training, whether it be low volume or high volume. They get in these camps, and I understand that many of us were tribalistic in nature. That is our ancestry. We look to belong to a camp, a crowd. However, sometimes you have to go out on your own, and you have to really experiment with things and be willing to say, all right, I've tried this for 3, 6, 9 months. I've been responding a little bit, but I'm really not seeing strength progressions. I'm not really seeing an improvement on my body composition. Let me try something different. Let me put this in the hands of a professional and seek out assistance and guidance and try something that someone will look at all my characteristics, all the context within my lifestyle, my history, my goals, everything that my time constraints, and will build something that's designed for me in a way that will hopefully best suit me, and just buy into the process and give it your all, and then see if you can respond. Because there's multiple studies that look at both resistance training and aerobic training. And there's one, I think it's Churchward Vinay, like 2015 study. And they looked at, and the title of the study is literally like, there are no non-responders in resistance training. And they saw that we see two things in the literature. We see that sometimes it isn't that the person is a non-responder, it just hasn't been long enough. So a lot of times with the intervention length, it just hasn't been long enough. So they've actually done some time course studies. So what they do is they do multiple measurements throughout the time of a study. So in this one specific study, it was a 24-week study. And after 12 weeks, I believe around half the group, 40 to 50% of the group, were non-responders. After 24 weeks, it was a very small percentage. Everyone had gained some muscle, and actually they gained more muscle over the second 12 weeks than the first 12 weeks, which is not what many of us would expect, because there is the law of diminishing returns, where generally, if you're new to training, you would gain more in the first 12 weeks than the last 12 weeks. That isn't always the case. The second thing is, sometimes it's not only the duration, it's the dose. So we see this very, very well in the aerobic training research, where they look at different interval or different sessions durations. So they'll do 60 seconds of aerobic training, and they'll have one group that does 1 time per week, one group that does 2 times per week, 3 times per week, 4 times per week, 5 times per week. In one of the research studies, they found that the 4 and 5 times per week group, every single person was a responder. The only time they found non-responders were between 1 to 3 times 60-minute sessions per week. So what they did was they took those individuals that were categorized as non-responders, and they just simply increased the dose of their training by 2 per week. So if you're in the 1 time per week group, you went to 3. If you were at 2, you went to 4. If you were at 3, you went to 5. Every single person was a responder at that point. And so it's not only the duration of how long you stick to something, sometimes it's a dose. So it may be you need more volume, you need higher intensity, you haven't pushed yourself close enough to failure, and you just don't realize that. So that's not on you, but you could work with a coach that can look over your form, can really give you adjustments, give you advice, give you guidance. And so there are so many parameters. And there's another area of this research in terms of response heterogeneity that looks at the health and the overall, so like the global impacts of resistance training. And they find that when they measure multiple variables, that every single person will respond in one aspect. So if they look at lean body mass, they look at metabolic rate, they look at bone mineral density, they look at strength. Every single person in these wide data sets will respond favorably to one of those parameters. So maybe you aren't the person that's going to be a power lifter. You're not going to be maximally strong. You're just never going to be the strongest guy or gal in your gym. However, you may be a responder from the aesthetic point of view, where you gain a lot of lean body mass and you have a great physique. You just may not be the strongest. Your form might not follow the function. However, there's something within resistance training or aerobic training that can benefit you from a health, from an aesthetic, from a function perspective. So try not to get so wrapped up in what other people responding. And that's really why I like this individualized individual responses literature, because this really shows us that we're all different. We're all going to respond differently, and we can't compare ourselves against anyone else, even because a lot of times people will compare themselves to other people on social media or in magazines or whatever they see, and they're not even doing what that person's doing, nor do they know what that person's doing. However, when we see this in the study where everyone's doing the exact same training intervention, meaning sets per week, the setup, the actual exercises selection, the same rep ranges, and they still respond differently, we have to realize that there's massive variability, and you have to work with the cards that you've been dealt and give it, and you maximize those cards and you make the most of it. But don't let this be like when you see other people in the gym and they're progressing more than you. Run your own race and focus on stay in your lane and run your own race. And I think that this is the type of literature that can really elucidate the fact that we can all respond. You just might not be on the right program for you.
Yep. No, 100%, man. I love all that. And yeah, I like that it's even if maybe from a body composition aesthetic standpoint, is maybe you aren't necessarily don't have the greatest genetics for that. You're still going to get something out of resistance training, aerobic training, whatever it may be. And that's most important too. So like changing your kind of what you're focused on as well too, and just maximizing yourself. I think that's key. Yeah, man. Ton of great information in here. Is there anywhere, anything coming out on your end or anywhere where you want to lead the audience to?
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, you guys can follow me at Brandon Dacruz _, which is on Instagram. For any coaching inquiries or consultations or things of that sort, feel free to reach out to me at bdacruzfitness@gmail.com. I will be presenting at a conference the first week of February. We're still working out the details, but it will be in Nashville, Tennessee. So Jeff, I will keep you informed on that. Yep. That will be based out of Jeff Black's gym. So I will keep everyone up to date on that. But for anything else, guys, another thing, you guys are already on a podcast platform, so we might as well plug my podcast, which is the Chasing Clarity podcast, which you guys can find on any podcast platforms every single week. At this point, we're about to release episode 80, and I've done a deep dive on more topics than you can think of. And so if you guys have interest in podcasts on evidence-based information, and then just also the practical application, which is something I know Jeff does very well himself, and that's something I respect, feel free to follow us there, Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness Podcast. And as always, Jeff, it's always a pleasure, my man. I'm glad we got to link up again for a deep dive, which we haven't done in quite some time, but I know we got to do part 2. So we'll continue these going.
Yep, we'll have to get the nutrition side of things, like you said, man. Yep, again, appreciate your time, man, and we'll talk to you next time.